What I've done, and we were able to borrow an oxygen meter and also measure a meter that measures pH and the amount of salinity in the water and the temperature. So I'm going to have a couple people help me go back out, and we're going to measure the water parameters and then have you guys write those down. What have you heard about? So this is a muskeg. It's got rotting peat down underneath, which means there's very little oxygen towards the bottom, and then it's got that sphagnum moss, that cushiony stuff that we were walking on. But when you think of a muskeg, do you know what kind of water pH or water quality characterizes a muskeg? Have you heard people describe it?
It's a little acidic, isn't it?
It's very acidic, that's right. So we're going to predict, our probe measures pH, we're going to predict that it will be acidic. Usually low oxygen content, hence these fish are air breathers. That's why you see only Alaska blackfish out there and nothing else.
Do they breathe, do they use their air bladder, or do they have a lung?
If they're considered a mud minnow, so mud minnows down in the Olympic Peninsula of Washington breathe with their swim bladder. These guys have a very unique air breathing organ. It's called an ABO, air breathing organ. They breathe through their esophagus. Do you remember from your internal anatomy dissections what part is the esophagus? Do you remember seeing that? What is it? Tell me, Ben.
Hey, I don't know.
Can you remember where it is?
Dawn. Yeah, well, yeah, what part of the internal anatomy is the esophagus?
Its mouth, towards the head it goes to the stomach?
Yep, it's actually a muscular tube in the digestive tract, and I used to think the esophagus was like the back of the throat, but when you dissected blackfish, it's a distinct muscular tube, and it has a sphincter at the beginning and right before it turns into the stomach, and that sphincter closes, so they gulp, they swallow a gulp of air, and they hold the bubble of air in the esophagus, and it gets absorbed. There's a person named Crawford who studied this in the 1970s. What he did was he did histology examination of the swim bladder, the air bladder versus the esophagus. And do you know how he decided it was the esophagus? What led him to conclude that? How do you think he looked at the histology, at cell cross-sections of the tissue lining, the esophagus and the swim bladder, and concluded that it was the esophagus that was the air-breathing organ? What would it look like? What do you need to absorb?
Lots of surface area.
Surface area lined with what?
Capillaries?
Capillaries. So it was red, vascularized surface tissue that had just a ton of capillaries. Because, you guys, bless your souls, finished the IACUC training, we have permission to gently, kindly euthanize a blackfish and dissect it at the lab, and next week we're studying respiration, and I will take a blackfish and euthanize it and cut open the esophagus, and under the dissecting scope you will see this brilliant red tissue. It's absolutely amazing. These fish, people tell legend, the natives like to eat them as a delicacy, especially in Arctic Yukon-Kuskokwim communities where they don't have a lot of salmon. And they describe, so the best way to eat a blackfish is boiled live like a lobster. Sounds kind of cruel to me, but you know, that's how we eat
So these
lobsters.
pretty good eating?
They're supposed to be absolutely delicious.
Can we try some?
If you like. So anyway, you have to boil them live, but they want to eat them in the wintertime. So they put them in a 5-gallon bucket full of water, stick it out on their porch during the winter. It freezes solid. You got these blackfish inside, the water's frozen, it's ice. They bring it inside their cabins, thaw it out, and the fish are alive. And they've done in the 1950s, Per Scholander, who's a famous physiologist at UAF, tried to do controlled lab experiments with freezing blackfish. And everybody says you can never freeze a fish and have it survive. It's not like a wood frog. Wood frogs can survive extracellular freezing of their tissue. They produce a glucose antifreeze. Fish have to employ freeze avoidance mechanisms, and we can't explain how blackfish survive, but they do. You can read stories from 100 years ago, these trappers going out and seeing people feed whole frozen blackfish to their sled dogs, and they write, you can read these descriptions of, and the dogs threw up the fish, and the fish were alive, because the fish thawed out in their stomach. So there's all these freaky stories about these fish, but it's really amazing. These fish, although they're not native to our area, and Chrissy studies invasive species, we're not sure if we should call them invasive yet because we don't know what negative impact they have on natural aquatic ecosystems. They are native to western Alaska and native to Siberia, and that's the only place in the entire world where you find Alaska blackfish. So they're really a cool fish. They're considered the only Beringian fish. In other words, they were around when the Beringian ice bridge formed during the last glaciation. So that's their entire distribution is the Chukots Peninsula of eastern Siberia and western Alaska. Up along the North Slope, along western Alaska, down through just the beginning of the Aleutians. They were introduced to Anchorage and Lake Hood in the 1950s. We think by accident they were brought in on a float plane, and the float plane pilot saw them in his floats and said, what the heck, and let them go. And they've spread, we're not sure how. We think that perhaps people are deliberately introducing them because they like to harvest them as a delicacy, but we're not sure. I'm sure there are other ways that fish get spread by birds and natural waterways. We believe that there are probably pockets of underground water that you don't see out here where these fish can move. Where we're going to the other side of the freeway, I was trapping blackfish out of a man-made pond. It was a wetlands pond, but I've never seen any other fish other tine blackfish, and I trapped a nine-spine stickleback. And it coincided with nine-spine stickleback being trapped about a quarter of a mile away in a stream. And I'm convinced that there are underground passageways where these fish, subterranean passageways where they move. They can move underground through conduits, kind of like, you could call them a cave fish. They're not cave fish, but I think personally, although it hasn't been proven scientifically, I think that there are ways that fish can move. Now, what do they do during the winter time? Do you think that they spend the winter out here, or do they move into deeper water?